Morning, Barry.
I had to acknowledge the recording. I didn't see the box to acknowledge it.
All right, Barry. Good morning.
Morning. Let's see. I'll close that window. Yeah, that's the problem, is that that box to acknowledge that I'm being recorded is on a different monitor and a different window. And if I don't see it, I got to go look for it. Otherwise, I can't continue to proceed.
Let me see. I'm going to bring up my notes in case we need topics. How you been this week, Barry?
Not too bad. Trying to find enough to do to keep myself busy without, exceeding my declining energy levels as I age. This is a really interesting problem. It's not a problem I anticipated, but as one ages, both your physical energy goes down, but also your motivational and cognitive energy goes down. Your ability to spend time thinking deeply, that declines. And the payoff for the effort and the emotional reward gets sort of, doesn't, a lot of things no longer seem worth the effort. And I haven't figured out how to solve that problem. I just do less and less and end up being bored, but can't find anything to do that's a sufficiently low-hanging fruit that it's worth doing.
Can I suggest that that might not be entirely true?
Well, it's certainly a phenomenon I'm experiencing. It's probably not true for everybody on the planet, but that's something that I'm experiencing. And I'm not really sure how to pull out of it. It's a little bit like being depressed. In fact, maybe it's a lot like being depressed.
It sounds like low-level depression, yes.
Yeah, I've suffered from low-level depression probably for 35 years.
See, I don't actually consider that unusual. I think everybody does.
Yeah.
You know? Even people who are outwardly, just rah, 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 that's definitely a show. That's definitely a mask.
It's harder and harder to get enthused about something because your estimate of the likelihood of success is declining, which is sort of a probability estimate based on increasing amounts of experience. So when you're young, you'll try all kinds of risky and foolish things that you don't know are foolish and have high risk. And as you grow older, you go, I'm becoming more and more conservative because these things have increasingly reduced probability of paying off.
That's right. All the ways that they could go wrong, right?
Right. I've experienced enough of them to know that I don't want to live through that again.
Yeah. Well, that's why death works.
Well, I think that's part of the reasons that our system is designed, that we grow old and die so that the young and foolish can start afresh, and maybe a few of them will succeed where we've all failed. I mean, I look at the remaining. I look at the remaining unsolved problems, with sort of the highest level problems, that classical dozen of mine, and I go, my God, we've been wrestling with these for 5,000 or 6,000 years, and they seem to be getting worse. I mean, maybe locally, briefly, one gets better, but ensemble, we're not making any progress. And I can understand mathematically why we're not smart enough and disciplined enough to solve it. But I have no power over 8 billion people to be smarter and more disciplined. I mean, and what are you going to do? Well, be a hermit? That's not going to work either.
Can I suggest something?
Sure.
This issue, which I think many of us have mulled over in our own minds, is when I'm young and stupid, right?
Yeah.
When we're old and wise, but low energy. When you're young, you got energy just
coming out
the yin yang, right? So the question is, how do we do this intergenerational leverage where the young can essentially be smart enough to try and leverage the wisdom of the elders, and the elders can be engaged enough to offer their perspectives to those who are still young and foolish, but willing to learn.
Yeah.
And not do it in a jaded fashion.
Yeah, that's why I was back in the 90s, I was real enthused about online learning communities, because the online learning communities, most of the participants were adolescents, and there were a handful of us adults who were in the education business, the science education business or the STEM education business. And that balance was there. I was getting great satisfaction out of playing the role of mentor, educator. But what's happened on the social networks is the young people seem to have wandered off somewhere else. They're not on Facebook. I don't know where they are. But now I'm hanging out with a bunch of old fogies like me, and we're just sort of going over the same old stuff that we've always enjoyed. But, but we've been there, done that. It's not that, not that about it anymore.
To me, it's not the same old stuff. To me, there's always new ways of looking at things, which leads to new possibilities if we choose to make it that way. If we want to just sit back and say, oh, we've been through this before. I'm just here with Barry on a social call and, Josh on a social call. And, we're just going to go back to our regular day. That's not why I'm here, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, I'm always looking for some, what's the frontier that I haven't explored that's still worth focusing time, energy, attention on. And I'm running out of frontiers that, that meet the requirements, that not only are they worthwhile frontiers, but I have the wherewithal, to make some progress and not just go around in circles on them.
So can I tell you a little vignette about my dad?
Sure. Oh yeah, go ahead. I think I've heard this one before.
No, my dad in September will turn 90.
Oh, wow.
When he finished his 5th book, probably 5 or 6 years ago, he said, okay, I'm done. I'm going to retire. No more books for me. He's in the last stages of his 6th book. He finally decided, yes, there was more in him. He wanted to get it out. He wanted to present. And by the way, he makes almost no money from these books. The most he's ever made from the first book, like 30 or 40 years ago, I don't know. I doubt he's even got 10,000 from that one, okay? And it's actually one of the Mathematical Association of America's bestsellers at the time. Okay, it was about complex numbers and geometry and the relationships between them and how I could prove things back and forth, using the other. And it's written at the high school level. So he's written on a number of different topics. He's written on complex analysis. He's written on geometry and algebras. So he's not doing this for the money. He's doing this because he's taking copious notes through his entire life, and he's not very shallow. He's obviously, one of these sinful perfectionists who can spot errors everywhere. Okay, so he wants to present the best clear explanation of everything. Okay, so in fact, one of his hobbies is going around to different mathematical problems and presenting better proofs. And one of his books is exactly that. Maybe 2 of his books is exactly that. I don't know if you know, there's a guy named Ross Hansberger, very famous mathematician. He's got a book of interesting problems and solutions. He's gone through every single problem in that book and presented his alternate solutions. And Hansberger wrote the foreword to his book or books. Yeah. So he's finding that he's still got stuff that he wants to get down and shared, not necessarily because anybody's going to read it, but because he's understood more as time goes on, and he understands how to explain more clearly as time goes on.
Yeah.
And he's still got 6 publishers willing to publish his books. So, he thought he was done probably at 84 or 83, and yet he's worked the last 5 years on his 6th book. I hope he gets to a 7th. So I don't know if there's anything that you wake up and say, hey, I'd really like to do X, Y, Z. Like, I'd really like to go to Yosemite, or I'd really like to study analytic theology with 3 other people who really get it. Or I'd really like to write a book about, something. Or I don't know, Barry, I personally am actually very, very enthused about what we're doing in that new Facebook group. I really like it. I really like being able to take almost anything, whether it's wisdom or whether it's foolishness, and really examine it closely and really say, okay, is this really sound? Is it really well-founded? Is it well expressed? Is it true? Should it be shared? Or the opposite, should we put a stop to this thinking? Is this sloppy thinking? How can we actually delve through to it to understand that, hey, there's nothing there? I really think that that's a skill that I would like to develop and get better at. And I think everybody ought to, but I think at least, the few people in that group might actually appreciate that notion. I'm thinking, since you feel like you want to contribute there and you are active there and you are active on Sundays, I'd really like to, especially if you want to do this in a one-on-one, Barry, if you feel more comfortable, really try and, find out where that spark is, Barry, and sort of flame it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I put a bellows on it.
It is an interesting topic, and I have presented it to small groups a few times. The audience who's really attentive and really interested is minuscule. And it may be down to, you might be the only extant audience or participant who's interested in this, at least that I'm aware of. Maybe Neil Davidson, I don't really know enough about him to know if he would be interested. But a lot of the stuff that I would really like to leave as a legacy, it's very, very hard to find more than a tiny handful of people who are willing to sit still and attend to it. I mean,
there's one, there's one, Barry. In other ages, if you were Bruno, if you were Bruno, you would have been killed.
Yeah.
For thinking new thoughts.
Well, that's why Copernicus waited until he died before he allowed his people to publish his book. Galileo was more foolish. He spoke up while he was still alive and got clobbered. And I have spoken up on things, and academics have clobbered me for asking hard questions about their models.
But as a system scientist, you are supposed to ask those questions.
Exactly. And so when another would-be scientist or supposed scientist, throws me out of the conversation, I lose respect for them, because they don't seem to be doing science, which is to be able to answer the questions that raise doubts about their thing. The really big one in my discipline, not my discipline, but my field of interest is in physics. There's this famous Bell's theorem, Bell's inequality, which was worked out in the 1960s and sort of languished for 20 years before somebody did an experiment to test it. And they found that Bell's inequality does not hold in our cosmos. It's false. And yet people look at the mathematics of Bell's inequality and they can't figure out what the hell's wrong with it. Now, I looked at it and I said, I can see exactly what's wrong with the derivation of Bell's inequality and why it doesn't hold. When I try to reveal that, I get knocked down because Bell got the Nobel Prize for this inequality that makes a prediction that doesn't come true in measurement. And it seems to me the interesting thing is, where did Bell go awry? Where's the mistake that leads him to make a prediction that doesn't hold?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. How long was Bell's inequality out there, accepted as true, before you questioned it?
I didn't really get interested in looking into it, I think, until maybe well into the 90s or even the 2000s, because it was really the YouTube videos that was studying, doing videos on explaining quantum mechanics and that kind of stuff that I really began to get enough material to appreciate why this was such a paradoxical conundrum, and why there were so many disagreements on what's the interpretation of Schrodinger's equation, what's the interpretation of quantum mechanics, why there were so many competing narratives, not all of which were mutually incompatible and none of which seemed to make any sense. And eventually, I found the one that does make sense. It's an obscure one called quantum Bayesianism. And it basically says the Schrodinger's equation is just a shortcut for Bayesian inference. You have a prior probability, then you get a measurement, which is some new data, and then you update your probability, except that in quantum mechanics, you get the final answer. It's like rolling the dice, not knowing what it is until you look, and then when you get all the probability vanishes and you find out how it ended. And so the collapse of the wave equation is really Bayesian inference in the trivial case that you get 100% of the missing information all at once.
Yeah.
And the probability simply, the distribution collapses. And if you study probability and statistics, you go, what the hell's complicated about that? That's routine. You roll the dice, then you look at the answer and you find out which way it landed. And in the meantime, you were in a mental superposition. It could be anything from whatever to whatever, according to some distribution.
Okay, so I want to make sure that we acknowledge Josh and Stacy have joined, but I have another follow-up to this that I'd really like to present. But Stacy, Josh, you guys want to enter and engage?
I would just want to tell Barry I looked up that probability, the Schrodinger's equation, and watched a couple videos on here's how you break it down simply, yada, yada, yada. I still don't know how we can apply it to other things, but I think for quantum physics, it's really important. But I see what you're saying, like in mathematics and statistics, there's other kind of equations that work better. But I would love to find a use case where then you could try to apply it to. So that's just my ask for today, is to really have use cases of things that are practical. And then we take the abstract things like Schrodinger's equation and try to apply it to those use cases, if possible. And
the best use case I know of that's really valuable is if you apply Schrodinger's wave equation to the orbitals of electrons around a nucleus of an atom, you get the shapes of the orbitals. And they're not like the original Bohr, which is those simple, elliptical orbits. They are these clouds that have these funky geometric shapes, these dumbbell shapes, yes, and sphere shapes, and those are actually precision solutions to Schrodinger's equation. So when they show you this is sort of the cloud, this is sort of the shape of this particular electron, and that electron is sort of, filling in that cloud, and you get these lovely geometrical pictures of how you place the electrons in these orbitals at these different energy levels. That's a fabulous application of Schrodinger's wave equation, and maybe about the only one that I would really consider, worth attending. Assuming you want to know, what does an atom look like? If you could actually see what are the electrons doing, where are they?
I mean,
yeah, and I think just to be clear, I was talking about something other than quantum physics, meaning cross-discipline. Do a quantum physics probability equation to how many grains of corn are in a giant silo, something like that, like a cross. Go ahead, Sam.
Fermi problems.
See, this is interesting to me, Josh, because this is where I see too many people misapplying quantum thoughts. And they use the word quantum, or they use the notions from nanophysics and try and explain, let's say, phenomena around daily life. I know that there's curiosity in doing this. There was definitely application if we can trace the validity of that thinking. But I find that there's a lot of people using these words like quantum and intertwingularity and, et cetera, in a very sloppy way. And that, in fact, is why I want to do this thing on Sundays. I want to, clear away the cobwebs around those kinds of thinking. I mean, the probabilities that Barry's talking about are on this scale, in fact, smaller than that, obviously. And so the question is, with that level of improbability or impossibility, does that really apply to daily life? And how does it? Now, maybe there's mega effects that do, but we don't understand. But to just say, oh, there's quantum phenomena, therefore that explains why I thought about clouds this morning, to me is just, there's too many leaps there. I'm not saying it's invalid. I'm just saying I don't find the validity of that thinking. And that, to me, is why I want to do Sundays.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really knocked my socks off until I really understood it is why timekeeping doesn't have a standard. When we learn physics, we learn about, space and time and velocity, and you've got distance, you've got time, and you've got the ratios, and you get velocities. And we always thought of time as having a standard definition.
Because
and
it's
then
not constant, right? We know it's not constant.
Well, so this is the point that Einstein comes along and says, if you've got two clocks which are otherwise identical and you elevate one above the other, the difference in the gravitational field strength is enough to make this clock run faster than this clock. Eventually. And you can actually measure that today with modern atomic clocks. Yes. And we would, most of my life, we never bothered to think about that. But that difference in timekeeping is extremely important in a lot of applications, in particular GPS. If you didn't take that into account, GPS wouldn't work. But it also explains why Bell's derivation, Bell's inequality doesn't work. He assumed uniform timekeeping. Duh, you can't assume uniform timekeeping. Two particles speeding away from each other will encounter a gravitational gradient, and the clock for one will speed up, the other one will slow down, and they get out of phase, which means the quote entanglement decoheres. And that's why it doesn't agree with his prediction. He assumed that they stayed in perfect sync. They don't. They run on independent clocks, and they don't stay in phase. Yeah. That answers the question. And why don't the explainers simply point out you can't rely on Bell's inequality because there's no cosmological clock that keeps the same time everywhere and every when.
Yeah, that's why my parents think I'm late all the time.
Because you're in a strong gravitational field.
I'm in the cloud. Hey, Stacy.
You're a heavyweight, Sam.
Hey, thanks.
Stacy raised her hand a second there, I think.
Yeah. Can I insert some imagination to ask a question?
Sure.
So if what Barry is saying is true, and the gravitational pull or whatever, that's what accounts for a difference in time, can we imagine that when people talk about emotions and frequencies and lower vibrations or heavier vibrations or lighter energies, that could affect time? And that could affect any kind of calculations. And I'm not even saying what kind of calculations, because I don't know all the kind of calculations there are. All I'm saying is that's a reason to watch our language, so that at another time when we have more information, we would look at different things that might need to be measured instead of just saying they're woo. Go ahead, Sam.
My initial response is no, because the effects of being, at this height versus that height are micro, possibly even nano.
So to me, you're not a good scientist. Just to say that you can't ask.
No. Stacy,
no.
That statement did not take into account what I said. Okay?
You said you
didn't even let me finish. See, this is triggering for you. I know this. Okay?
It absolutely is, because you gave an absolute no.
No, it was not an absolute no.
You didn't say not at this time.
It was not an absolute no.
You said
I said
no.
The effects are nano. I said the effects are nano.
At this point.
Yes.
But at what point might they not be nano?
But you didn't let me finish. You interrupted me, and I was about to say, if we can measure these effects, if we can understand the phenomena that can lead to this and use the language that approximately then maps to what you just said, I would find no problem. But the fact that there's such a quick leap to such statements without really looking at the validity of the scales of phenomena that are talked about. Like, is there enough energy in a nano erg? Okay, let's take a nano erg. Is that really going to change the way you feel, for example?
That's not what I'm saying, Sam.
That's what I'm saying, though.
let me just interject for a minute. What I'm saying is maybe we wouldn't be able to do that for 100 years. But in the meantime, wouldn't it be a good idea to get our language down properly now so that in 100 years, when we see that, we're already using the proper language in other areas? That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I say there's no problem with that. But to me, if you cannot actually derive interesting phenomena or observations from it, then the time and energy spent to create that language is in a sense wasted. Because there's actually more.
But it's not wasted to shift from using good and bad to heavier and lighter. It might be wasted in terms of science, but it's not wasted for, let's say, mental health.
But it's not measurable. It's not feelable. That's the thing. So to explain it in phenomena that you cannot measure and you cannot actually feel, to me, unless we see it, that's sloppy.
Dolly Parton sings a song, you may or may not have heard it. It's in the Trio album, Do I Ever Cross Your Mind? And it's a song about nostalgia and remembering, puppy love when she was much younger. And the thing about the song, which is really fascinating to me, is that it has a very regular metronomic timekeeping beat. As the song goes along, the bass line is very, very regular, clock-like. And then there's a lyric, how I wish I could go back in time, because this is thinking nostalgically back about young love. And when she sings how I wish I could go back in time, she alters the timekeeping of the singing of the phrase, how I wish we could go back in time. And so she modulates sort of like, not like ragtime, but a very carefully modulated timekeeping of the lyric. And also the musical beat that you've been listening to for the whole song also does the same thing. It has this time perturbation of the location of the beat. And psychologically, when you hear this, your brain is running at this clock. The beat set the clock in your brain. And suddenly when she says, I wish we could go back in time, it feels like you're walking at a pace and all of a sudden you kind of do one of them, And so you have this very visceral feeling that of a time warp. And it's because the time reference of the music and the time reference of your brain get out of sync. Your brain keeps running at this rate of the metronome, and the music suddenly has this warp. And so the relative disconnect between two timekeeping is a very palpable, guttural experience or visceral experience. And I used to listen to that song quite a bit until I really, really understood exactly how Dolly Parton pulled off that trick. It's a fabulous musical trick to perturb the timekeeping, to change your concept of going backwards in time.
So go ahead, Sam.
Go ahead, Stacey.
I was just asking you if in that story you're drawing the connection between the word and the effect of the word.
Well, yeah, because we have this sort of very simple concept of time, that it's a regular thing, it's a metronome, and it's fixed, and it's the same for everybody, every place, for all time and all place. There's this cosmic clock. And then you have this realization that no, two clocks don't keep the same time. And the clock in my brain doesn't keep the same time as a clock on a wall. And so I can be, if I'm in the flow state, time for me is running fast because I'm getting a lot of things happening in a short amount of wall clock time. And if I'm bored, I have the sense that time is really running slow. So if you're bored, so you have this notion of relative timekeeping because the clocks that are referenced, your time reference, are not running at the same rate. They're not in sync with each other. And so you have this psychological effect, which is quite palpable in real life. If you get a news story, the 7 a.m. news, and you're aware of it and it's changing your behavior, and somebody else slept in and didn't listen to the morning news and they don't know this news story, you're going to have a disconnect in your reference of what's happened. So one person doesn't know something, half the other person does, and that changes their behavior. And they go, where are you coming from? So you have these real life effects of people getting information at different times because they simply weren't in receiver mode as early as they could have been, or they didn't process it. And when something strange happens, you may be bewildered and you don't really understand what all this stuff means in terms you finally figure out, oh, that was a calamity. That was just people died. Holy shmoly, people died. I didn't know that. Who died? That person died? So you have this delayed arrival of information or the delayed processing of information relative to the people who figured it out first. And you get these disconnects between different demographics who are paying attention and those who aren't. It has nothing to do with gravity. It just has to do with when you gain access to information and process it and decode the signals. Josh,
you just made me think of something, the latency of reality, where Sam's saying something and he hasn't finished to the completion, and then Stacy's waiting for that information to process, but she's already processed the whole 3 pages in her head in a fraction of a second. And that latency of different processors, of Sam's processor, Stacy's processor, and then the communication between the two of giving information.
Yep. And
then you throw in words and symbols in between that processing, because we're not always thinking in English.
Yep. My concept of space and time and velocity are much more arcane and mathematically technical and different from sort of the kindergarten concept of time, space, and speed. So the notion that we have very simplistic mental models, which are reasonable approximations for the life here on the surface of the planet. But when you start getting into designing a GPS, for example, you can't use that because it won't work. When you get down to how long does it take a radio signal to get from here to here? A nanosecond. Well, you think, a nanosecond, I don't care about that. But if your car is 10 feet off of where you think it is, because that's only 100 nanoseconds, you're going to have a collision. You're going to be in the wrong lane. So at some point, it matters. And realizing where these tiny differences add up and matter, if you don't take that into account, you're not going to have a career as an engineer designing a GPS. You're going to build a system and people are going to have collisions because they don't know where they are when.
And you also have to know, when you're building a system, how much error is tolerable.
Yep.
Like, is a nanosecond of error actually going to make a difference for the applications in which the GPS is being used? Right. For example, targeting missiles, right? That's really what it was built for originally. But now we're using it to actually drive cars. So missiles, how well do they have to be targeted? Depends on the target, right? But some of these tanks are only 20 or 30 feet long, right? Or 10 feet wide. So you got to be that degree of accuracy. So, point of trivia question, since you probably know this. Do you know the degree of accuracy for GPS?
About 5 or 6 feet for the commercial version, I think. Maybe less, maybe a foot.
You could be right. But when I was looking at GPS very closely about a dozen or so years ago, it was 17 feet. 17 versions was how well you could actually trust your GPS location.
Yeah.
In all dimensions, height, and north to west, south, et cetera, et cetera. But that was not the first version. The first version of GPS was actually much, much less accurate. Yeah. There were 2 different versions that they released to the public. And they only released the more accurate one much, much, much later than the first. Yeah. The first one, do you know how off that was?
Probably a fraction of a mile.
If I recall correctly, it was about 300 feet.
Yeah.
But it went from 300 feet approximately down to about 17 feet. Now it could be even better, but I haven't looked into it in the last decade.
Length of a football field, yeah.
Yeah, Josh.
Just adding on to that, the routers and the Wi-Fi signals that came in 2002, they were pinging off of those for the cars for Google in the 2000s in order to, make their self-driving cars go around, but I'm just saying there's a lot of other signals on the ground, not just that GPS model, in order to find more positioning and accuracy and triangulation. So I'm just saying there's so many different waves. I always think of like we're in a soup of radio signals and electromagnetic waves when we're walking around. So to just bring up the aspect of when you start measuring, there's many ways to measure, and space and time are just two of the measurements. There's other things that are involved. So
and we can call that triangulation, except it's not just in three different, or two different directions. It's in different dimensions, but it's the same general notion.
When we were sailing, and I was playing around with celestial navigation, and I only really did it when we were at anchor, so I could test it to see how good it was, and then the boat wasn't rocking, so I could get a good reading. It turns out that your timekeeping device is very important. If your watch is off by 4 seconds, your east-west guesstimate of where you are is off by a mile, because the Earth rotates, a mile every 4 seconds at the equator. And so we had to have very good crystal watches if we were going to do celestial navigation, sight some object in the sky and say, how high it is off the horizon, and then do all the sight reduction mathematics, a bunch of sines and cosine formulas. 4 seconds of error in what time you took the measurement, your east-west is off by a mile.
Good thing Magellan had a Rolex then. Hey, so the original topic that I was talking about with Gary was, how do we get intergenerational leverage? In other words, Barry said he's actually feeling this low-level depression where he's not truly energized to do almost anything. I said, hey, Barry, we got a whole bunch of these young folks, and yes, young folks have a lot of energy, but they don't have the wisdom that Barry's got, or other elders have. So I've always been wondering, how do we get this intergenerational leverage where we can get young people to try and leverage and benefit from the wisdom of the elders, and the elders to still, have positive impact on the direction that these younger generations take without being jaded. So the elder folks have to be, authentic and not jaded, and the young folks have to be really curious and not so stupid and wild. That to me is a very fascinating question that touches on just about everything we're talking about for the last 5 years.
Josh?
Yeah. Just a thought is you've got to pick something that sort of crosses the two. And that is a serendipitous thing that just happens from chit-chatting, older people and younger people chatting. And they both say, oh, you're really into parabolic metrics of mirrors and solar. You know what? Me too. I'm really into that. Like something that just, it's not a pop thing, or it's not something that's cultural or in the zeitgeist. It's something out of the zeitgeist. That's what I'm trying to say. Something, but they're both passionate about it, and then you can go from there. I'm complete.
Stacey, then I got something.
There also has to be curiosity on both ends. It can't go one way.
Yep.
Yes. So the example I'll pick, and Barry, I'll apologize to you in advance because this is going to be something that's negative in your area. Sports. The Warriors won the NBA championship yesterday. Okay. And I don't want to rub it in, Barry, okay? But I used to live in the Bay Area for about 3 decades and love watching the way those guys play. However, that's not the point. The point is, what's interesting about sports is I can get 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds or whatever starting to look at something like batting averages or percentage of field goals made or numbers of three-pointers, in the top 5, etc. So you get a level of curiosity in the young people through sports, okay, that introduces them to simple arithmetic, eventually, simple averages and, means and medians and etc. And then you get into more interesting things like correlation, does Kevin Durant really deserve the 2 championships that he's got? All those kind of discussions, okay? So what's interesting is you can pick something like sports And you can then get younger generations interested in thinking about these things. And the way they think is they argue, right? Oh, Steph Curry is better than Kyrie Irving, okay? And then they have this argument, okay? Morris rings here.
Hey Sam, I got to stop you for a second just because I don't want to turn red. I watched every single Celtics game there was this last year. I met Larry Bird, Robert Parrish. I worked at the games when I was a kid. Just letting you know that, but go ahead, continue.
Wait, and
that's fine, because that's a different generation.
And I just want to let you know that I don't know who they are. I could care less. I'm already bored out of my mind.
I love it. Thank you, Stacey.
Yeah.
We're on the exact polar opposites.
It gets young people interested in skills and developing skills that they otherwise would just not be exposed to. Somebody who's not interested in sports doesn't care about averages, for example, or forget sports, okay? You can talk about music. Music actually gets people to
talk about money.
Level thinking. What was that, Stacey?
Money is a universal kind of.
Maybe I find that the younger generations don't have the same fascination with money. You know.
Well, I'm just saying, for me, where sports didn't, like, you know, for math, where sports didn't cut it. Like, my dad was always talking to me about percentages and, you know, banking rates or stuff like that. And that was really interesting to me. You know, how much could you earn if this, that, and the other? Because I don't like sports.
Anyway, I think my point got lost, but, you know, I just want to make a point about how sports and other kinds of interests that carry through generations could actually be the thing that weaves those intergenerational conversations and chats. And therefore, there could be some mentoring on both sides. You know, I heard some quote that if you're over 40 and you don't have a mentor under 35, you go find one. You know, I use my daughter for that.
Yeah, the one discipline that I really enjoyed working with the youngsters on was the concept of model-based reasoning. And we were in this simulation world, this online learning community, and it was a buildable world, and you could build models of whatever you could imagine or whatever was real. And so they were doing model building, you know, and when I introduced the term model-based reasoning, that was not in their vocabulary. It was a whole new concept to these adolescents, that there's such a thing as model-based reasoning, and that it has value to, you know, become proficient in it. Sam, you were about to say something.
I would like permission to build on my earlier point about young people and stats, okay? Because there's another point to be made on that. One of the things that I see is after some major sports event, like a game, like a series, okay? You go onto ESPN, you get onto CBS Sports, you get onto Fox Sports, you get onto NBC Sports, and there's hours and hours and hours of talking heads. Yeah. Who's better? This person, that better. This team, that team. That dynasty, that dynasty. This generation, that generation. And I find it fascinating that people will watch this for hours and hours, but they don't actually tune in when people talk about, okay, what's capitalism doing to our democracy? Or what is the far right doing to the constitutional structure of the government? You know, it's so little. And so in those kind of commentaries, what we live with are what, 6 second, 20 second, you know, sound bites. And yet people will watch for hours debates about who's a better point guard.
Yeah, yeah.
And that is a malaise of what we're facing.
Yeah.
It's a symptom, it's a syndrome, it's a cause eventually. Yeah. Josh?
I'm just going to bring up, that's a huge cognitive bias on your part. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because that's your lens and your perception. I agree with you 100%. I'm in the same cognitive bias. Why do people spend $100 million on an entertainment of a movie that's over in an hour and a half when they could do so much more with $100 million? Until I found out, oh, they actually make another $900 million for every 100 million spent. They make, so it's a, you know, it's a money thing, like Stacey was saying, it's the money conversation. But the why of the tribal aspect of sports and the intergenerational, like I'm already training my daughter to like the Celtics. So she's 1 year old. I say the word Celtic. She points at the TV and then points at the basketball hoop and goes, gets all excited because of our energy when the Celtics come on. It's intergenerational and tribal. And that's why sports are so different than there are families, though I bet you it's not as many because of the popularity of sports, but I bet you there's at least 1.2 million people who intergenerationally watch politics with the same fervor and have the same feeling about the Republicans or the Democrats or Milton Friedman's economic values of, I'm sure there's one out of 320 million people in America. I bet you there's at least 800,000. I would just venture to say that are very passionate and go to clubs. Go ahead, Sam. I just want to point out those cognitive biases.
First, but I do have my hand.
Go ahead.
One sentence. I just want to say, I hope there's even more people that are going out of their way to try to pull that tribalism theme out of their daily life consciously.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you about that, Josh, because if there truly were, in the same way that people actually study sports, I would expect to see stats like, okay, so here's Stacey Abrams' stats in her county and what she's voted for and the kinds of people that vote for her. I would expect to see stats about Herschel Walker and what he's voted for or what he stands for or how many kids he has. Those would still be collected stats, by the way. And, but I don't see those stats. So that's why I would like to believe you that there's 1.2 million people that actually care so much. But if they did, where are those stats? Where are those charts? Where are those mini graphics,
Can you explain the stats you want to see exactly so I understand?
Anything. I want to see anything done to the degree of detail that I see in sports analysis applied to politics. In other words, we see talking heads in politics.
But there's so many of those websites that have come up in the last 10 years.
But they're not featured. They're not featured on Twitter. They're not featured on Facebook. They're not featured on
they are.
6 seconds. I don't see them. Okay.
Well, you're not in the wrong bubble.
Show me some links. Show me some links, Josh.
Yeah, calm down, relax. Jeez, holy crap.
You made a statement. I'm asking for the evidence.
I'm happy to share with you. I'm just saying relax, like Politico 369.
I was speaking, you interrupted me. So if you want to interrupt me, I'm looking for the evidence.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, like, you got to calm down for a second because, like, they're there. I'm just letting you know I'm not I can't rattle them off the top of my head, but I do remember when politics were heating up in 2014 with Bernie Sanders. A big generation started, like, I think what was the number? You probably remember this too, Sam. It was like 369.
I posted a lot of those.
But a lot of those have evolved, I'm saying, from 2014 to 2022. And there's a whole new generation of stats in politics. I'm not privy to it because I don't follow those, but I have watched those come up. And if I look at my YouTube stats, I've seen new channels go up to at least 1.5 million. So that's why I'm using the guess of there's at least 1 million passionate people. But go ahead, Sam.
So I'll grant that point. Okay. Let's say that those stuff exists. Okay. If it does exist, then the people that produce it, the people that read it, should be making inferences from those stats. They should be reasoning from those stats. And if they were reasoning, they would find correlations with, let's say, the policies that Trump supported versus the policies that Biden versus Obama versus whomever supported. And they would be able to say, this doesn't compute. Why does this not correlate to that? Why does, the building of a wall not generate in better crime statistics? Why is it that, we get $4 billion spent on a wall and yet 200 people pass through the wall every day or whatever? Because it's a very simple thing to pass through. They would be thinking these things. They would be making these correlations. They would be making these points. I don't see that. That's my point. Is if they were doing the same reasoning, if they were interested to the same degree of detail, if they were collecting the evidence, if they're presenting the charts, presenting the stats, reasoning with them, saying, oh, that 5% could be attributed to blah, blah, blah. This 3% is really the reason why, blah, blah, blah. There would be that kind of discourse. It would be data and evidence-based. That's not the character of conversation and dialogue I see coming out of politics, especially in the far right. That is my point, okay? That's why I question whether or not this is actually being done to the degree of detail I see being applied to sports analysis, which you claim is being done. Over.
People that are tribal by nature are not good reasoners, at least not about the topics they're tribal about.
I agree.
That's quite a generalization.
I turned off the minute you said Golden State Warriors, and I'm a Celtics fan. I literally, my brain, I felt the cognitive bias. I felt it
Golden
turn
State
off.
Warriors.
I was like,
rock!
oh! And I love Golden State Warriors. I followed them last 10 years, but when they play against the Celtics, I hate them. Like it's literally a turn off. And I'm saying, like, you got to see your own tribal biases yourself, Sam, too, because your filter bubble is two ways. It's one where you're getting your information from, and then it's the processor that you're going through you. You have two filter bubbles. And then outside of that, there's the generational filter bubble, because you and I are not talking to 17-year-olds. At least I'm not. I don't know. Maybe you are. I don't have any kids.
I'm talking to 19-year-olds.
Okay. Where are they getting? Some of them are really into politics now. Like it's like a new thing. Like the young kids are more into politics than older people.
You know, one of them was way more when they were 16 and 17. Much, much less now. They see the crap that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Because they look, they got over the age of voting. Yeah.
Hey, the Celtics will have the next decade, Josh. Okay, they're young, they're strong, they're athletic. Don't worry about that.
I'm done. We had 6 years. It took us 6 years to build that team. It was literally 6 years. I've been following them from right before Jason Tatum came in, the year before Jaylen Brown. That was a lot of work, and we went through hundreds of players with those three. We even got rid of Horford and got him back. So I'm saying that was a lot of work just to get that team there, and I felt like they were better than Golden State. They just somehow gave up, or of course, I'm going to say this because my cognitive bias, maybe they were paid off. I don't know what happened, but I thought they were a better team than Golden State. But Curry himself is a better player than all of the Celtics. So let's just leave it at that. I think Curry and Green have the will and the force to go through all of the people on the Celtics. But as a team, I think the Celtics were a better team. But I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, I'm done.
I'll leave it at that.
Yep. Can I change the subject then? So I was going to give an example of interesting statistics. I ran across a story a few days ago, and it was looking at where is all this gunplay violence taking place in the U.S.? Because you get the big stories like, where an 18-year-old goes into one venue and shoots up, a dozen people. But there's something like, 20, 30,000 gunplay deaths a year. And somebody did a statistic, says where do they occur? And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 90% of gunplay deaths take place in 4% of city blocks across the country. They're highly concentrated in just a few city blocks compared. And there are places where there's no gunplay at all. There's no gunplay in Bedford, Massachusetts, where I live. But, you can go to 4% of the city blocks, the inner city, and you can find something like 90% of the gunplay deaths. And they don't make the news because they're happening, all the time. But there's an interesting statistic. And of course, they're mostly, minority communities that where these 4% of the city blocks are. Same.
Let me riff on that a little bit. Decades ago, national media eliminated smoking ads, right? From
commercials,
from broadcast shows, because they thought it had an influence on the young.
Yeah.
Right? Yet there's probably, some statistic, like 20 or 30,000 impressions of murders and gunshots and whatever for children by the time they're teenage years. And I guess that's okay, because that's free speech. But smoking, I guess, is not free speech. So we think watching smoking commercials has an effect. and watching other things doesn't, because this seems to be normalized now. On the flip side, if it truly did not have an effect, why do ads in the Super Bowl cost $4 million every 30 or 60 seconds? If they're spending that kind of money believing that watching media has no effect, then isn't that almost the very definition of a waste of money? So clearly there's an effect there. We just don't want to acknowledge where it is. Over.
Yeah. We don't do the math. Math is way out of whack from what we're focusing our attention on.
You don't even have to do the math, just ask the questions.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask Stacy, what did you want to talk about today? I'm very curious, just because we've been going off on tangents all morning and we haven't really landed on anything. And I don't know if you were ever asked that question.
I don't have anything in particular. Thank you.
Just wondering if there was something living with you today, because.
No, actually, always the way we talk to people. I was listening to the conversation. I don't know, I guess Sam was talking about a particular Facebook group. I don't know anything about it. And Barry,
neither do I. I'd love to know about it.
And I was saying the biggest problem is not, and this is in the academic communities or in, I'll say more intellectual communities. It's the same as in any other communities. It's the way we question each other. And that leads to the conflict.
What do you mean by that, Stace?
It's either the person receives the question as a direct attack, or the question actually sounds like a direct attack, or there's too many points in either the original argument, or there's too many points in the question, so it's misunderstood. There's just too many misunderstandings. It's not broken down. So sometimes I'll post something and, somebody who's into, somebody I consider a really smart person, they'll make just like a whatever comment. And so I'll usually say, well, what do you think? Because I'm not exactly sure. And then we get into a good conversation and we take it one step at a time. And then you get to see where all the in-between stuff is. So like when I put in the comments about the duh was about when Barry was talking about the scientific principle theory, where you get all the information at once. The duh was that it happens in story too. It's like saying, it's like getting to the end of the story, but not knowing what all the pieces were that led there. Of course there's going to be errors. So thank you, Josh. That was.
It's really hard to know how to ask a good question that isn't off-putting. I mean,
yeah.
Trying to introduce the scientific method into these discussions backfires. I can remember asking somebody who I thought was, a well-respected scientist, who put forth a thesis having the topic happened to be cold fusion, but that's irrelevant. And the thesis, I was pretty sure was an incorrect theory, an incorrect model. And I said, how did you falsify the null hypothesis? Perfectly good question to ask in discussing alternative scientific theories. You propose a kind of a novel theory that's kind of astonishing, and you say, well, then you must have ruled out the default hypothesis. How did you rule it out? Because I don't know how to rule it out. And he says, we don't use the null hypothesis in this discipline. What? So there are questions that you want to ask that are important to ask in a legitimate scientific scenario, and then you find would-be scientists or people who claim to be scientists, and they depart from the protocols of the scientific method simply by denying the null hypothesis without saying, how did you falsify it? How'd you rule it out? Just saying it doesn't, it's I don't believe in it. That's not falsifying it. And I see even just yesterday and today on a discussion on my timeline. I saw somebody simply denying the standard model. And I go, I don't see how you could rule that out. How'd you falsify it? The example was a digital system that's computing the same thing as an analog system can't do what an analog system does. And so simulations can never be equivalent to the analog version of doing the same thing. And I go, wait a second, the Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem disagrees with that you can take anything that's analog, and once you get it band limited and quantized, then the digital stuff is mathematically interchangeable. You can choose it either way. I said, how can you say the digital system can't do anything that an analog system can do? And he says he just asserts it can't. How do you rule that out? How do you throw away the
Can you give me an example?
I'll give you an example.
No. I'm not asking. No. I'm saying the way you deal with a person like that is you say, can you give me an example? You make them think.
Oh, I see. What you're suggesting is, why didn't I say to this person, give me an example of an analog system? See, what I did is I said, it doesn't matter what example you give me, because it's going to be quantized and band limited, because we live in a real world where things are quantized and band limited. And therefore, I can invoke the Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem, and without loss of precision, compute the same thing.
Yeah, this is way too over my head.
Well, well, Barry is saying he knows that he's correct. He's knowing that the statement that he heard is provably false.
I understand, but he's also asking, how do you deal with those people? And what I'm saying is, I would start with asking them to give me the example. Then when they gave me the example, if they were even able to, I would show them how I could do what they said I couldn't, and how their example is incorrect.
The example is already on the table. This is about the sentient chatbot. And he says, because it's done in a computer, it can't be sentient, because you have to have an analog brain to be sentient. And I go, an analog brain is quantized. You've got neural peptides, which are molecules, are quantized. You've got nerves firing at a relatively low frequency. They don't fire at gigahertz rates. They fire at relatively low rates. So you've got all the requirements met for the sampling theorem, and therefore you can do a digitized version of it without loss of information.
Yeah, but the fact that we can doesn't mean that we have.
Well, I mean, we don't digitize all the way down to individual, neuropeptides, but you don't need to.
Well, for consciousness, you might.
Yeah, that's been my field of study for the last 5 years, consciousness, and be careful with that word. That's a dangerous word.
Right. There's no commonly accepted definition of consciousness right now.
Well, that's the problem. Sentience and sapience and consciousness are sort of these, what Minsky calls suitcase words. They're words that have a very sort of a vague concept. It's like soul, soul of mind. These are suitcase words, and so you can adopt a preferential definition that rules out all the others simply by fiat, And I say, well, you can't really do that, because that was the whole point of the Turing test. If you can't tell the difference, then how do you know how can you rule one out?
Right, but the Turing test is different. It's not that one person could be fooled by a bot, okay? But there's no specification on how many. Do we need 10? Do we need 100? Do we need 1,000? Do we need 1,000,000, to be fooled by this bot before we say, oh yeah, it's, human equivalent.
So anyway, but that sort of gets in the way, because people adopt a position as dogma. And they assert as dogma that system can't do what this system can do. And I point out, that doesn't violate any laws of mathematics, that it can't emulate it. And in fact, the chatbot was making up stories. The guy says, tell me a story. And the chatbot, I don't know, it doesn't say how much time it took, but it comes up with a story that's not in the literature. Now, you can ask me to make up a story, and I might take a few days to come up with a crappy story, because I suck at storycraft. Other people are much better at it than I am, but I was astonished that, these were coherent stories. That's pretty, that knocks my socks off. Sam?
Barry and Josh. CDs or vinyl?
Well, people like the noise in CD. I like the noise in vinyl. They like the hiss. They think that's authentic. Of course, you take the hiss out, and the music sounds what's the word? Antiseptic.
I'm just riffing
I'll
on
ask it. I'll ask another question. What sound card and what needle?
Stanton 681 Triple E is what I used to use.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course,
in other words, the storage versus the pullback.
Yeah. Of course,
Go
you
ahead,
can
Barry.
put the wow and the flutter and the hiss back into digital. They just took it out because it's not part of the original music. It was part of the medium. So you take out the artifacts of the medium, and then people get used to the non-information parts of the medium. You can put those back in. They're just random.
I think you're accentuating Barry's point, and also what Stacy's always saying about, there's a lot more than just A and B, this or that. There's so many parts of a sound device. And then there's also the listener too, because like Cusella has only one ear that works. So she's hearing in not in stereo. And so if the device is, the new, I think I guess it's some new car that has like a Rolls Royce or something with 27 speakers and tweeters, where are you listening to the analog versus digital, the CD versus, there's just so many factors. And I think that's what it comes down to with consciousness. Like I was studying jellyfish, like I'm pretty big on consciousness, and like, things where their neurons are so big, you can see them with the human eye. Yeah. But why does a jellyfish swim up to a pier and then go around it when it's got so few neurons? How does it know to go around something? And how does cognitive behavior work in a seed? How does it know to grow in a way that produces a tree? And and to me, when I study all these things, it comes down to not space and time, but actually temperature and coherence of atoms and the bonding and covalence of things meshing together. It's more of a temperature problem, not a time and space problem. But that's just what I've come to realize, is that temperature plays a bigger role than space and time, even in gravity.
Well, because that's your energy source, or it's correlated to your energy source. But, if you look at the size of the human genome, or any genome, not just human, and you say, the genome will fit on a CD. There's about 750 megabytes on a CD. And if you look at the human genome, it's about the same. So you can actually fit your entire personal genome on a CD. And yet, if you look at, the architecture of the body and the architecture of the brain, there's a lot more bits to specify that than were in the genome. How does that happen? How can a few instructions create something like this? Well, the answer is it's fractal. The same instruction that generates the palm then generates the fingers, because you're using the same information over and over in a fractal process. And that fractal recursion is what allows you to build a complex system like a brain or a whole body out of a very small set of instructions. And it took a long time for people to figure out how the devil can a very small genome be the blueprint for a very complex big system. That seemed like it seemed like it was a paradox, but the mathematics of recursion solves the paradox. How many people understand how a very simple recursion law that like one line of mathematics generates the Mandelbrot set? How can this one little equation recursively generate something that's got so many bits? And the answer is it's recursion, but most people don't get that. Go ahead, Joshua.
Oh, I'm just going to add on to what you're saying and also say that the instructions themselves, the information, is not a solitary thing. It's not by itself sitting in there with no other interaction. That's why I was bringing up temperature. Yeah. Information changes. Like even a human being, if you put them in a hot sauna, they'll think very differently than if you stick them out in a cold winter. Yeah. Their brains, their neurons will literally fire differently. Right. And the information itself inside of the genome is not the only information that it uses to fold you know, whether it be skin or cells, and that's why I got into bacteria, because I feel like if we keep studying, bacteria is one layer. So there's 27 to 32 different pieces of microbiota for every cell. But if we keep studying it, I bet there's a whole nother 20 different factors that we don't even know about yet at this moment in time that play a role into the biology of a human or biological and, you know, living organisms. Like there's so many things we don't know about at layers and levels that we keep learning. And I think it goes on forever. I think it's infinite. And that's why I think being intellectual and writing books and being in academia and classifying it as protein folding and manifold and think, oh, well, I'm a doctor, I know exactly in Latin you're missing a point of reality where a whole nother species from another planet has populated the 90% of the planet that we haven't even discovered yet, which is called the ocean. And the vents down at the bottom of the ocean hold the key that we haven't even seen yet. And thus there are organisms that don't apply to any of these rules. For example, the octopus that has a completely different DNA structure with 50, you know, for our 25,000 genes, blah, blah, blah. It could literally go on forever if we allow for extraterrestrial life to be interfering with this planet, which we take that out of the equation. Just like in Schrodinger's box, you have to be in the Schrodinger equation inside the box to calculate it. Schrodinger's equation doesn't work outside of the box. Am I correct, Barry?
Well, there's a problem with Schrodinger's wave equation. It was designed to specify one infinitesimal particle, but they try to use it for distributed systems. And I go, well, first of all, what are you going to plug in for the parameter t? Because one particle has an age, it's local time, but if you have a distributed system, every point in space is its own independent timekeeping. What the hell are you going to plug in for time?
That's what I found too. And that's why I'm saying, like, these equations that are universal are far and few in between. Even E equals mc squared. I mean, we're talking about light moving in what we know of as reality, but we've never been past the Kuiper belt. We've never been far, far away and lived, you know, in 7 galaxies over to the right. We don't know that light travels in the same way that it does in this. You know, we've barely even been off Earth. Like, we think we've been to space. We haven't really gone that far into space. We barely even
the astronauts that went to the moon were still within the Earth's gravity, because the moon is, by definition, the moon is within Earth's gravity. It wouldn't be a moon, it wouldn't be a satellite.
And what if physics are totally, completely different outside of this 9 or 8 planetary system that we have?
Well, that was a big question. How do you determine that the laws of physics permeate all space? And of course, when you get to black holes or the Big Bang, we know that our physics breaks down. We know that we get to singularities when things get too dense. For example, people say, what happened before the Big Bang? And when you ask that question, it betrays the notion that time itself begins with the Big Bang, because as the universe gets smaller and smaller, running it back in time, it gets so dense and the gravity gets so strong that clocks stop. So the definition of time, there is no such thing as time, because there's no such thing as space. When space is zero, time and space go together. So you can't have the concept of time until you have enough space for something to move. And so clocks stop and space stops because there's zero dimension. You have no distance and no time. So how do you measure time at you can't even say before clocks stop, because when they stop, there's no such thing as time anymore. That's a very hard concept for the layperson to appreciate.
My dad wrote a book on that, actually before there was time, before the Sea of Never and the Well of When, and before, it's a hard concept to think of.
We're used to timekeeping, being a reasonable standard, even though, yes, we know that time runs at a little bit different rate, if you're at a higher elevation. But yeah, when you get to the threshold of a black hole, your clocks stop.
So if we did not assume that light traveled at sea, in at least the observable universe, we would not have some of the theories and confirmations and experimental results that we actually have. Like, for example, Einstein's gravitational lens.
Exactly.
That kind of assumes that light goes in a particular way. Now, I'm not saying that's everywhere, but that assumption has led us to the gravitational lens.
If there's no matter, if you're in space where there's literally not a single particle of matter, then you can go back to Maxwell's equation and say, yeah, a photon travels at the speed of light in free space, and you have this formula, epsilon naught and mu naught, these magnetic and electrostatic permeabilities of free space. As soon as you have matter, so you have gravitational gradients, that now affects how photons travel.
So there's a number of assumptions in science. I want to acknowledge that, okay? And yet, you know, as long as they are useful, it's okay to say, okay, let's suppose this is true. That doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Let's just say, suppose it's true for now, and let's just work within that context. Similarly, I think there's heuristics that turn out to be useful. The one that I invoke a lot is Occam's razor, okay? If you can explain something more simply than, you know, something else, why not go with a simple model? And that's actually turned out to be very useful, okay? Doesn't mean it's absolutely true, but it's still very useful. There's a number of these very useful things, you know, axioms in mathematics, you know, assumptions on the speed of light, Occam's razor, that are just useful to use.
Yep.
And as long as they're useful, use them.
Yep.
The minute it's shown to be not useful, expand your thinking.
Yep.
Okay. But that's, you know, the way to proceed is I'm not going to take 17, 18, 90 billion other ideas and assume they're useful and work with that. My brain's not smart enough to do that. Barely can handle these 3 or 4 different frames of reference, but they're still useful. And it's from this limited consciousness, this limited mentality, this limited knowledge base that I'm actually trying to expand my awareness and my ability to reason. And I think that's okay. That's all we can do. That's all any of us can do. Over.
Josh?
I just keep thinking about what computers are trying to do at this moment in time with engagement for Silicon Valley and making money, but then later what they can do for usefulness. Meaning right now they're just trying to get everyone to engage on different platforms to make money for the different software developers that created those platforms and the advertisers that are the model. But over time, as it collects more and more information from us, and there's better algorithms that interweave it in between all the people involved and all the possible connections, what could it do to create life that's better for humanity or possibly better for another organism that exists outside of humans, because humans are just improbable and don't need to exist because they're messy?
Go ahead, Sam, you go first.
Okay, liking that point and riffing on that point is another quote unquote assumption that I'd like to put on the table, okay? There's an assumption that I'm beginning to question. The assumption is that we as humans value other human life. That assumption underlies a lot of policy, whether or not we want healthcare for all, whether we want universal basic income, whether or not we want housing for all. But to me, more and more, there's a huge segment of population that exhibits behavior that makes me question whether or not they value other human life. So this is no longer a safe assumption.
Warfare. Does
Warfare.
Putin value human life in Ukraine?
Bingo.
Yeah,
right? Agree. So I think it is fallacious, dangerously so, to assume that other people care about other human beings. We have to clarify this. Yeah. And if that's actually going to be on the table, that, hey, it's okay to not care about other people. And oh, by the way, capitalism has that built into its assumptions.
Yep.
In capitalism, you're not caring about other people.
Right.
And yet now we wonder, oh, how come we have all these homeless? Why? You didn't build it into the into the economic model that you wanted to base this country on.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm getting a little bit animated here, okay? But that assumption about whether we care about other humans needs to be examined. And we need to either reaffirm it or just blow it out of the water. And I just need to go and kill 9 billion other people so I can take over the planet. Because that's okay.
Very depressing. Yeah,
right?
And that's very depressing.
Yeah. So can we have that conversation in the larger community? Somebody has to step up and say, yes, we acknowledge this policy does not value other people. And here's why.
We had slavery.
Slavery.
We wiped out the native populations, you know, conquering native populations. Looky there. There's a kiddo for you. I wanted to go back to Josh's point about, you know, what are we learning from computers? And I think we're learning something very important from computers, computer networks, because we all grew up in kind of a rule-based culture that the regulatory mechanism for humans is all about, you know, hear the rules and follow the rules. And computers introduced us to something that people never thought about: protocols, functions, models, systems. And so people like Sam and me and those in high technology, we're steeped in the world of protocols and mathematical functions and models and systems. And yet the general public didn't grow up with these mathematical concepts. And I think a really powerful thing that we're getting out of computers, computer networking, is more and more people have discovered that there are these things called protocols and functions and models and systems. And these high functioning systems are working a whole lot better than our primitive rule-based human cultures. And not only that, but the mathematics is telling us that our rule-based systems, if you had built the computers out of rules and not protocols and not functions and not models, it would have been chaotic and dysfunctional, mathematically and engineering wise. That's an important observation that's worth educating the public about. But if you educate the public about that, you're undermining faith in the rule of law.
I just said Sam, Barry, Stacy, and she went, hi.
Hello.
Say hi, go ahead, say hi.
Whose birthday is it?
It was hers on Tuesday.
Wow.
1 year already?
Oh, wow.
Big girl.
You want to say hi?
Hi.
Hi. Hi. Hi.
Don't get shy. Yeah, those are your friends. You know them. She's like, if she hears you guys' voices, she's like, let me talk. I know these people. I know them. So sorry, not to derail the conversation, but she was just like, I need to say hi.
Hi.
There it is.
Hi, Priscilla.
Hi. Ina, how old are you?
Sam, Barry, Stacy. That's Sam being silly. Yep. And that's Barry. You want to touch his face? Touch Barry's face. Oh, not with your feet.
On another note, I really wish Zoom would put us all in the same order for all of us. Why is that complicated? You know, I saw Josh pushing down before when he was talking about me, and on my screen, I'm up.
And you can move yourself around.
Okay, in US letter writing order, I see Barry, me, Stacy, and Josh. Is that what you see or not?
You can move it around at will. As long as nobody has their hand up, you can rearrange the positions of the postage stamps.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and I find that's very useful in certain kinds of meetings where you want the main speaker and maybe, you know, the respondents high up and the audience elsewhere.
Hey, Stacy, have you played with immersive view?
I don't even know how to do it.
Go to the upper right where it says view and go down to the third option called immersive.
I don't have a third option. I have speaker, gallery, and full screen.
Oh, really? You may have an old version of Zoom. How many of you have this option called immersive?
I have something called release video order. What the hell is that? What does release video order do?
probably get you back to the view that everybody else is seeing.
Oh, okay. So I see. So when I move, it's the order in which they arrived. Aha. So when I move things around, I get a custom order. But so it's the order in which newcomers arrived. That's the default order. I didn't know that feature existed.
Or it undoes your manual defaults. But anyway, there's a choose immersive view for those of you that will upgrade your Zoom software that actually puts you into different environments. So you can put yourself into a dining room, a conference room, a forest, around a campground. It'll present that view of all of us clustered together. So it is different than just rectangles of our rooms, just FYI. So if you upgrade your Zoom software, you might get that option.
You probably need a paid account.
I think you might need a paid account.
Oh, maybe. I don't know. I do pay.
Yeah.
I have a free account and I don't see that. And my Zoom updates whenever there's a new Zoom.
Well, let me see what happens. Okay, let me put in Zoom immersive environment. Now, what do you guys see?
Nothing different.
Hang on. Let me do it.
Oh, now it's different. Now it's black. Now you're. Oh.
Yes.
Yeah. Now we're.
You see this?
Yes.
Okay. So maybe only
but what order
can do this.
But what order do you see people? So I'm in the far left. And
yeah, right now I see Stacy, Barry, myself, and Josh. Let me see if I can drag. No, I can't drag anybody this way. No.
Well, that's good. At least we're in the same order.
I didn't know about this feature. I've never seen it before.
In fact, let me show you a different view.
You're blowing Stacy's mind, Sam. Stop.
This was not very interesting. Let me find.
There's only two of us.
Because it only shows the ones that are on video sometime, I guess. Let me try doing this. Yeah, okay, here we are in a big auditorium. You see that, Stacy?
Yeah, no,
now it's a different order. Now I see Josh, me, Barry, Stacy.
Yes.
Wait, Josh. Yes, we're all seeing the same thing.
Yes.
This doesn't blow my mind. I prefer this. Well, I don't prefer this. When we go back to the box, I'll tell. My only concern is when we're in the squares and we're making gestures towards people. If somebody's viewing it, they think we're gesturing towards different people. And somebody like myself who reads gestures is thinking that is reading the signals incorrectly. So like that was my only feeling about being in the boxes and seeing a different order for different people seeing a different order.
Mm-hmm.
This is just annoying. These views are just annoying.
Go ahead, be a ham. Say what you're gonna say.
I will be right back.
You know, I was gonna say, there's a guy on. Have you heard of Omegle? Do you know this platform? Omegle.
Yes.
There's a kid that hacked it with OBS, the broadcasting system, and he broadcasts the person that he's talking to themselves and puts them in news stations, and then uses magic trick. Hey, I'm talking. Yeah, hi. And then he puts them in a situation where he does like magic tricks where he's using CGI, and so he'll just fly out of frame. But yada yada yada, you can get really fancy with Zoom with your camera's experience with other cameras by grabbing Stacy's face and putting her flying through. I mean, it's a whole new thing. If you go on YouTube, there's all these people hacking different platforms like that. But I digress.
Well, hacking video, the way that does, but there's another way that we can actually hack it. We talked long before about whether we want to, this reminds me of conversations with Colin, where he wanted to see gauges and dials and sliders and things like that. So if we have, let's say, our video, but it's decorated around the edges by our emotional state, how much time we got left, whether or not we're heated, whether or not I'm properly hydrated. There's a number of different things we could pick around there, right? And some of those would be, from sensors that communicate directly to the gauge, or we could actually slide some of them around manually. I could say, okay, I want to speak. That would be my own action. But what, my body temperature would be metered by somebody else. My heart rate could be measured by somebody else. My percentage oxygen intake, could be something else. And if you're seeing I'm getting lightheaded, maybe you're able to make more allowances for the blabber that I'm doing, as opposed to someone who's green across the board. So there's ways to modify the video to give us useful information, whether or not we're just being entertained versus whether or not we're actually trying to collaborate. And these ways of augmenting the video are definitely things that, I've even written up specs for these things. I just haven't built them yet.
You know what this reminds me of? Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message.
Yeah.
Here we're attending to the medium, and the conversation is about the medium, and there's no message other than look at the medium. Well, look at the affordances of the medium.
Yes, for this segment, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's the whole game, right? It goes back and forth between what you can do, what you should do, and what you will do. And that whole game of just because you can, like, why does the dog lick itself? Because it can. Why do humans do all this weird stuff on Zoom with, sitting us in a stadium that doesn't exist because we can? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that sort of most of reality is like in politics too. Why does it do these illogical things? Because they can, and because it serves a couple people's purposes. It's not to help everybody, like Sam was saying earlier.
It's all spice and no nutrients.
I think that's a lot of why people do things is just because they can. It's not. Why does she grab the, like right now, she's a little kid, she's grabbing the keyboard, smacking, touching everything, trying to figure out how everything works, because that's, her path in life. And some people never grow up. They're 50, 70-year-old people who are still just touching things because they can, not because they should, or it helps other people. It's just they can do it, so they just do it.
Sam?
So I want to define a new notion of what it means to level up. Because I think, if we don't, in this sense, you might as well just go and eat all the ice cream you want, okay? So here's the idea. I've often railed against the notion that as technology and other social systems have evolved, it is becoming less and less necessary for each of us individuals, as individuals, and this is a generalization, it's not all true, okay, as individuals, to actually worry about our own survival. We've got Safeway down the street, we got a checking account, some of us, we got a car, it's not like we have to go down and hunt down our own kill every day, the rest of our lives, in order to survive. But with that, I think we've seen a shift towards entertainment. Let's say leisure time. The whole notion of leisure time, I bet you couldn't even define that 10,000 years ago.
Yep.
So with leisure time, we have actually found ways to expend it in ways that, just create entropy. What I'm proposing is a new notion of leveling up. I'm proposing that we take that leisure time and try and think about survival, not of us as individuals, but us as a species or us as a planet.
Yep.
That's the leveling up that I think I'd like to define.
Yep.
And obviously that's a notion that needs to be refined, but that I think is clear to me. That's what I would like to see.
Yep.
Over.
Yep. Cultural sustainability, collective well-being. Go ahead, Stacy.
I think maybe if we start as us as a community and then connect with other communities, that would be a good way to start and share what we're doing in our own little communities.
I don't want to specify anything about how to start. I'm just saying that to me is a definition. Now, as far as how, that's wide open. Yep. There's a zillion hows.
Collective and mutual well-being and sustainability are realistic objectives. If you're a community leader and you're worried about the community instead of your own little personal private domain, and that's really what community building is all about. What are the elements in community building that you want to work toward?
But it
What
takes
rate?
sorry.
The rate of learning, are people learning? Are they enjoying themselves? Or are they in a state of well-being? Are they out? Are they not in a state of anxiety about, going out and getting killed while they're buying an ice cream cone? So yeah, all of those make sense. What do you want the community to achieve as a community for the collective mutual well-being and sustainability of the community? Those are not new ideas. That's why they formed societies, governments, cultures, religions, tribes. These were all formed for those general purposes.
But I think it does involve, after recognition, some individual choices. Like, do I choose to watch an NBA game?
Yep.
Or do I choose to think about what I could do for recycling? And oh, by the way, the whole recycling thing has been a huge disaster. You know what percentage of plastics actually get recycled?
Probably, what, 20%?
Less than 10%.
Less than 10.
Less than 10%. Yet we've built entire industries around recycling and practices.
Yeah.
So we got to look at these things systemically.
Yes.
And then we have to ask, does this planet support 20 billion people?
Unlikely.
Does this planet support 15 billion people?
Unlikely.
Let's work backwards. Does this planet support 10 billion people? Does this planet support 8 billion people?
Not well.
See, now we're getting into tough questions.
Yeah.
Because we're approaching 8 billion people.
Yeah.
Did this planet even successfully support 7 billion people or 6? Or could it?
And where's the cutoff? What would be the optimum population for sustainability and well-being of the population?
Yeah.
And not all the suffering. You have all the suffering that's systemic.
And oh, by the way, when I was in the 80s, 1980, what year was that? 86, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in that time frame. When I was listening to these so-called smart people from the Harvard Business School talk about, if you're not growing, you're dying, I was so shocked that they would be saying something so flippin' stupid. And yet, I was just shut down when I raised that question. Oh, because these people are published in the Harvard Business Review. They were not thinking systemically. They're thinking short-term profit.
Yep. Not long-term sustainability.
Yeah, and that's what business was buying. Business was buying consultants that spewed this shit with this Harvard tagline. So systemic thinkers are shut down when they ask these questions. And now, what year is this? 2022, 89, 86, 82. Yeah, 35 years later. 35 years later, I still have to ask the same questions.
Yep.
Sorry, let me calm myself.
Meditate.
I'm gonna get something to drink. I'll be right back.
Okay. Yeah, that's sort of why I'm interested in analytic theology, which is basically sustainability, individual well-being, and collective well-being. These are issues that the community builders were thinking about at the dawn of civilization. And you had, government as a community, you had family as a community, or tribes, or religions, schools of thought. These are all trying to create communities that, in some sense, were trying to minimize the downsides and optimize the upsides. And they were trying to do it in some rational sense, based on experience, based on history, based on deep reasoning. And they were the pioneers of this. We're still doing it today. We're not the pioneers of it, and we're using maybe more sophisticated methods. But I think we also have to look at, what did the pioneers do that we're still doing today that's sensible, and what did the pioneers do that were obsolescent and anachronistic we no longer do, and evolve from there. Stacy.
Yeah, I was just waiting for Sam to come back. I'm going to listen in the background. I have a bad headache.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm going to just listen. It's getting worse. Yeah, I was fine when I got on. It was just little, but it's getting worse. So I'm going to just listen, and maybe I will see you tomorrow.
Sorry if I'm the cause of that, Stacy.
No, you're not the cause of it. Bye-bye. No.
Yeah, that back in the 90s when I was doing online community building online learning communities, those issues were very uppermost. In how do you create a community? In fact, M. Scott Peck, the psychologist, wrote a lot of famous books, The Road Less Traveled. I think his third or fourth book was on community building. And that was my Bible. When I was trying to do community building, I read M. Scott Peck's Toward Community Making and Peace. I think Different Drum was the main title, Different Drum Toward Community Making and Peace. And that was my guideline for building an online learning community back in the 90s. And that's what we thought about, how we're going to regulate and govern ourselves, what governance model we're going to use, what's our mission, what's our vision, what's our goals, how we're going to comport ourselves, how we're going to relate to each other. And that was really a very worthwhile exercise for me in my 50s back in the 90s of what goes into community building in an online. I was a little excited to see that, like in the Facebook era, the social networks, and the Zoom era, that some of these ideas were sort of, kind of left in the dust, weren't really adopted. Sam, you want to say something?
If that is of interest to you, it might be an interesting exercise for you to go onto github.com, and do a search on this phrase, code of conduct or codes of conduct. Because what's interesting to me now is many, not all, but many, possibly even most open source projects, and most of them are hosted on GitHub, have a published code of conduct. They're not all identical.
Yep.
Many of them are. But I think those would be interesting for you to look at and see if there's been any evolution in the last 40 years or 50 years, and whether or not you still have elements of those codes of conduct that might be useful for us to rediscover and adopt.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it's a very good thing that most of these open source projects do have codes of conduct. And by the way, even the biggest, most successful ones have controversy and scandals.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Linux has one, all the big open source ones have all had them. I don't know, there's a very few exceptions.
Debian Linux, which may be one of the biggest communities on GitHub, has had a social contract from the beginning. The Debian project began with the social contract.
Software for the public interest. That was their tagline.
Yeah. And so I think that's a very good example, because the Debian project survived and is world-class. A lot of distros are built on the Debian. Ubuntu is built on Debian. So that was an example where I thought, yes, they had the right idea. They carefully constructed a social contract, and it worked for a very large community, but a narrowly defined purpose, because it was just basically developed, to evolve Linux. But, it worked. So, and when Google first formed, they had a social contract among the employees. Now, I think they gradually retired it, but at least at the beginning of Google, they had a social contract. All the employees signed on to it.
What are you referring to? Because I was unaware that they had that, but I knew that they had a tagline. You know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, don't be evil.
Yeah, do no evil.
Yeah.
Which
and
they
I think
removed.
Yes. At some point, Google took down their tagline, their motto. And I also think that the social contract that all the employees subscribed to, I think that also faded, which is part of the reason I think why this Lemoyne guy got suspended, because in the social contract model, I don't think that would have happened. But Google got to be a big corporation, and then the corporate interests took over from the community interests. And even though it still has sort of an internal community, it's not the community building kind of became subordinate to the corporate objective. The corporate vision and mission became the dominant value. Same thing happened in capitalism. You know, the capitalistic values became dominant, which is also, by the way, I think why 9/11 happened.
I think capitalism assumed that people would stay decent. Quote unquote.
Bad assumption, very bad assumption. Look at Standard Oil, the antitrust suit against Standard Oil a century ago. The Rockefeller Standard Oil enterprise, that was a monopoly. And
but it's sad if we have to no longer assume that people can be decent
or ethical. I mean, ethics is an aspiration which most people don't even know how to aspire to, or even what it would mean to be ethical. They're just not on their radar.
Or if it has meaning outside a church.
Church is more about morality rather than ethics. I mean, you can learn ethics in a church, but most people don't sign up.
Most people, wouldn't you say most people equate the two?
No, the way I put it is, ethics is sort of the uppermost that you can aspire to. The law is the lower.
Wait. I know your definition. I'm talking about most people. Do most people know that distinction?
Most people probably don't make that distinction.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. But there is a distinction, just that they it's like a suitcase word. But people who study morality and ethics very clearly make the distinction. It's sort of morality is sort of the median, you know.
I think we had this conversation just the other day.
I thought we talked about this a week ago, maybe.
Yeah, I was going to say it was just either last week or the week before we had the whole morality ethics conversation.
Yeah, we did. You're right.
We can use these words. I wouldn't always characterize that we had the same conversation, but.
Yeah.
No, but I hear what you're saying, Sam, is like when you say most people, meaning the common person off the street, like your everyday average, take 100 people off the street, is morality and ethics equated to religion, or it's, yeah, I don't know what I think that the general populace changes so fast with this new internet age. It's really hard to do that now. You know what I mean? Like the common thing off the street would be the same kind of thing for a month and a half. Now it's for like 6 hours out of the day until you see that there were 6 mass shootings this last week. And then it changes that zeitgeist so fast. You know, that you see what I'm saying is like one thing before time moved in a different pace of information and news. And now it's so fast. What the common person on the street may think can literally be changed by a story coming out of another country tomorrow.
Yep. And believe baloney, you know,
the
lie will travel around the world before the truth gets its boots on. That famous quote from Churchill.
That's a great quote.
Yeah, Mark Twain and Churchill had slightly different versions of the same quote.
But that lie is like the lie turns into 17 lies by the time the news hits tomorrow morning, because the amount of pundits that go from 12 in the afternoon when the lie got broadcast to the amount of conversations throughout the 8 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, all the way to the next morning, it's already turned into 17 different stories of the lie. So it's too confusing to even jump in.
So, I mean, look at the example of the January 6th inquiry. You know, the big lie that launched January 6th was instantaneous, and the investigation into it's taken 18 months just before we're getting to the evidence of the truth. And that's sort of example of the lie, you know, speeds around the world and the truth is just barely getting its pants on.
And your point about it taking orders and orders and orders of magnitude more effort to combat a lie.
Exactly.
Than the actual lie itself.
Absolutely. Easily 3 orders of magnitude more effort.
Those of you that are more...
And what was the lie? Yeah.
That the election was
election was rigged.
Because I thought the lie was that Donald Trump told Pence that if he was not a pussy and stood up for him, he could overturn and anoint him as president.
Well, that was after. That was
another lie. He's at 14,000.
That was after the first. So the first the first lie it was stolen, and then the second lie was that he could do that to justify the
And
first
that he had
lie.
the power.
Is that
He
the
had-
second lie?
That he had the power to overturn.
I'm
the
just
election.
waiting for the Republicans to prove that Pence had the authority, because then Kamala Harris would have the authority, and then, you know, we're all set from here on out. Okay.
Al Gore would have had the authority. Al Gore was the
That's
vice
right.
president who counted the votes, you know, the electoral votes that which he lost. If he'd had the authority, if it had been a lawful thing to do, he could have done
Okay.
it. But it
So-
wasn't even an option.
Can I change subject slightly, because it's related to the
Please.
news, but a different part of the news?
Good.
No, but that was just fascinating that there were two different lies already.
No, there's
I'm just saying.
18,000 different lies. Those are just two of them. Those are just two of them.
Yeah, Stacy wanted to say something, I thought.
Stacy appeared briefly.
No, as long as you're changing the subject, I'm happy. I just think, yeah, I want you to change the subject. What you're doing.
Okay.
I was waiting because nobody's heard from Navalny in a long time. Josh, are you aware? Has anybody heard from
I don't even-
Navalny?
What's the guy's name or person's name? I don't know who we're talking about.
Navalny is the guy who criticized Putin, and he got put in prison. He was actually a journalist who for the last decade has been questioning Putin, and he's been poisoned, he's been imprisoned. He was imprisoned again less than a year ago, and now nobody knows where he is.
I haven't seen any stories about him lately.
You know who I'm talking about, Barry?
Yeah, I haven't heard anything.
Well,
I've
I
heard-
recognize the name, but I've sort of forgotten the details of his story that you just reprised.
I thought he was still in prison.
Well, we thought so, but now nobody has heard from him, and nobody can actually get any information about whether he's still alive.
If he's
So,
in prison in Russia, it'd be
yes,
very hard
he's
to
in prison
get
in Russia.
information out of these.
That's right. And if you want to
Russia's
choose
not a
another
source of
subject,
reliable information.
another one that's hot on my mind is this extradition of Julian Assange. I think it would have been worse
Extradition. Yeah.
had he done it, you know, had it been done during the Trump administration. But now, if the Biden administration convicts him and punishes him, the Democrats are done for, just like the Republicans.
Yeah. That's a strange one because he's not an American citizen. I think he's Australian. And he was not a resident, I don't think, of the United States when he did the WikiLeaks thing. So he wasn't. I mean, you can be a resident of another country and do something that's legal in that country, which would have been illegal if you did in the United States. Are you then subject to U.S. law? That's a hard thing to work out. Because why should U.S. law govern people who are not American citizens acting not on American soil?
I think it's because he took possession of quote unquote stolen emails, which were quote unquote US government property, which is ironic because it was on Hillary's own personal mail server. So if you're saying it's government property, then you admit she took government property into her own mail server. And if it's not government property, then, you know, different implications.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I doubt that even lawyers would be able to figure out a consensus on that.
They don't want to figure
Yeah.
it out. They're getting $550 an hour to not figure it out.
Yeah, that's right. They're not in the business of getting to the ground truth. They're in the business of keeping the meter running.
Right.
Which is another reason I don't have a whole lot of faith in the rule of law. They just keep the damn meter running and milk us dry, getting nowhere fast, going around in circles.
Yeah. Anyway, Stacy, I tried to change the subject.
I think the subject what we were starting with is just, you know, the latency of humanity, of being a human, having consciousness with other 7.8 billion humans, and our ability to communicate to each other, which I do think at some point, not with 7 minutes left in this conversation, but cybernetics is the real conversation moving forward in humanity at some point, because of the ability to communicate has to speed up. And messaging has to go from verbal communication to some other form of communication moving forward. I don't know what it will be, but it does have to change from what it is now.
Well,
it's not efficient.
That gets back to one of Sam's hobby horses, that mathematics is the language of relationships. So if you want to understand how things are related, You need a language which is powerful enough to express it and to compute the interactions. Spoken language is really a weak, word-based languages are very weak. If you try to take a course in mathematics where they only use word-based languages, you wouldn't get anywhere. You can do arithmetic by saying add and subtract. COBOL managed to, try to do everything in words, but as soon as you get to real mathematical functions, you've got to switch to mathematical nomenclature, mathematical notation. So we have this real serious problem that we really need to communicate complex relationships, and we do it without using the language of mathematics. We use narrative languages, which are very weak and vague and imprecise and easy to make what would turn out to be mathematical errors if you were simply to limit yourself to narratives. Sam.
Let me say one more thing, in that the expressions typically associated with mathematics have infix notation, which is bleeping confusing.
Yeah.
Because it's really hard to parse an expression that's using infix notation.
Yep.
The true expression, the cleaner, in my opinion, I'm just expressing opinion here, okay, is what's called reverse Polish notation, RPN.
Peel it back.
Specify the relationship up front and then talk about the entities that you're actually describing.
Right.
Have that be an atomic expression.
Yep.
And then compose those expressions. And there's no accident that the most expressive languages these days in computer science and AI research, symbolic AI research at least, are using reverse Polish notation.
And the push-down stack to implement it. Push-down.
Well, the whole idea of a whole stack was introduced by symbolic and AI experiments and research.
Now, if Stacy were on, I'd ask her, have you ever heard of a push-down stack, Stacy? And do you know what it means and what the metaphor comes from? Where's the metaphor of a push-down stack come from?
She said she had a headache. Don't make her headache worse.
Yeah, don't make Stacy, say.
The stack in terms of the layers with a computer, you mean? Like the...
No, that's different than the push-down stack.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
What is it?
So if you go in a cafeteria line, the guy who has your plates, they're in a stack that's recessed, and there's a spring. And as he pulls off a plate on the top, the next one pops up. All the data that you're going to use in your computer goes in a similar stack, and you always operate on the water cell on the top of the stack, and then you present it, and then the next item pops up, and the next instruction applies. So you're always operating on the top of the push down stack. So you can take something and put it back on the stack, push it down. If you take it off, it pops up. So that was the metaphor for this reverse Polish notation. It's a very, very useful visual metaphor. But most people, if you say push down stack, they don't know where the metaphor comes from or what it really means in terms of computer architecture, software architecture. Joshua.
I'm just curious because the terminology in computer science, at least in web development, is cascading style sheets. And the idea, does that what does that do to you, Sam? Are you okay?
It's the ugliest language ever invented.
It's horrible. And that's my point, that's what I'm saying, is like when you were saying push down, to me, that's like a cascading down.
Oh, no.
But the idea of instructions, the last instruction permeating over, that's why working in web development is really hard, because it's a huge mess of messes.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's HTML, there's JavaScript, there's CSS, there's tags, there's protocols.
It goes on and on and on.
HTTP. You got to be
JSON,
knowledgeable about
CGI.
The intimate little detail. And if you get that one little detail wrong, it doesn't work. Why does it not work?
Yeah, that's a bad architecture.
You forgot about responsive design, Sam, and all the different size screens we got to work on.
Yeah, that's a bad architecture.
You can keep going and going and going, okay?
Yeah, I'm surprised I'm not in an insane asylum at this moment in time. That's why
Actually,
I took a year off this year.
The fact that it's so messy and yet it still works is kind of amazing. I just hope that we have an opportunity to actually clean some of that up. You know about WASM, You know what WASM is now?
No, what is that?
Ah, you'll spend the whole weekend learning about that if I tell you what it is.
I'm excited.
It's machine language in a browser. Go look at that.
Let me see if I've seen it before. WASM.
Yes.
Machine language in a browser.
Yes.
When you say machine language, are you talking about?
Did you ever work with an 8080 or 8085 or a Z80 or any other 8086 processor at the machine language or assembly language level?
No, I did not.
Okay. So if you ever look at a processor or if you took any kind of a like computer architecture class, the most basic instructions for a computer are what's called machine instructions. Okay. It's like move, shift, pop, add, subtract, XOR, X and, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Those are basic, move to operand, move to memory, move to accumulator. Okay. Those are the kind of basic, but every processor made had a different instruction set.
Yep.
That's why software was so crappy and so.
No, I got it. I just looked up. I see what you're talking about. WebAssembly. You're talking
exactly.
about.
So this is now a standardized assembly language that will work in all browsers.
Which was what JavaScript was supposed to be.
JavaScript is not an assembly language. It's quote
no, I know. Let's. Yeah. I'm trying not to get into the weeds of the whole thing because it's 10 o'clock and I got to run. But I'm just saying. Where it gets very interesting is standardizing. Like I was showing Qcella yesterday, how browsers are different and what you type into the protocol at the top. Some of them put in the HTTP, some of them don't. Some of them put in and assume things. But the standardization of the internet is why I'm even on the internet, period. I got into the internet because I thought, holy crap, this is amazing. There's a protocol called Hypertext Transfer Protocol. What could you do if you created a standard browser? And then they created a browser. That first one that caught on was Netscape, was the one that got popular.
Mozilla.
No, Mozilla was the first one I used, but I'm saying the one that was like, I could go to universities and go to people's houses and everyone said Netscape. But then when they stole the architecture of another browser and put that into Windows 95, which turned out to be, the Microsoft browser, blah, 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 Explorer. I'm just saying it's the browser itself that's still involved. And that's what needs to change. Like you're saying, this assembly language inside of something that can run on everything. And where I'm really excited is this convergence of the two operating systems in mobile. Android and Apple are I'm seeing a convergence of those two operating systems slowly with the iOS Matterport and Internet of Things and this talking protocol between the two. And I do think there will be a new operating system. And I don't know if it's going to be Elon Musk that creates it, but someone's going to create a standardized operating system for all devices. And we're not there yet. But we're getting closer.
Because Apple had gone that direction before, right? They went and built their own operating system. They decided that, oh no, we should probably get something that's more Linux or Unix-like, and that's when they adopted something else for their MacBooks, etc. So I believe early on they tried Mach, and now I think they're actually much closer to Linux. I don't think it's actually Linux yet.
But I think they called it Darwin. Darwin was the name of the shell or the name of the operating system. I can't remember what.
Yeah, remember the Lisa
level, but it's called Darwin. It's called the Darwin system. That's the Unix system is called Darwin on the Macintosh. At least maybe it still is. I don't know if it still is or they.
Yeah. Well, but before I run, I was just going to say, if we could come up with a standardized system of systems thinking and a standardized model to model, like you're saying, with the scientific method, you found someone that was not using null function. If we could come up with some sort of standardized system that we could run through every building of every model of every system, and even if it's our own system that we're using that we all in this group agree upon, then we could start really collaborating on things. I feel like we're getting closer to having a standardized, even if it's a 5-piece formula, like this times that plus this, like a teeny tiny mini algorithm, if that makes sense to you guys.
Okay.
Like Barry's
fundamental building blocks. And that's what I called Saturday's, foundation laying.
maybe even the platonic solids, the 5, I don't know, something like that. Something where we can just agree on 5 things that when you interoperate them in different ways, that we all agree that we can go try models on,
Well,
at least to play. 5 little toys to play with.
I've had a few suggestions. Anyway, it is 2 hours. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Stacy. I'm gonna crystallize this leveling up meme that I think is a reasonable expression of what I'm trying to do.
Okay. Thank you for hosting.
I'm gonna go grab some breakfast.
Bon appetit.
What was for breakfast this morning, Barry?
I had not a muffin. It was, yeah, I guess it was a muffin and some dry cereal because I'm out of milk.
Yeah, I think I typically do a multi-grain granola with some raisins and some bananas and some almond.
Yeah, I need to make a run to the grocery store because I'm getting low on.
Yes, today's my weekly or bi-weekly Costco run.
Oh, I will probably go on Monday morning when there's nobody in the store.
You know, with gas prices the way it is, it takes $15 in gas alone just to make a Costco run.
Wow. Yeah, for me, it's just 2 minutes to the Stop and Shop from where I live, or 3 minutes.
Yep. All right, Barry, have a great day. Have a good weekend. Thanks for the conversation. Like I say, I'm really enthused about Sundays. I appreciate your participation. So anytime you want a one-on-one to light that spark, I'm willing.
Okay. I would be looking forward to that. Yes.
All right.
Ciao.
See you tomorrow.
Yep.
Bye-bye.